So we find ourselves together quite a bit because I think we like each other, some more than others maybe, but also because we're part of the same cause with the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. And I remember, being in that room when a handful of us were first starting this thing, because we knew that in the absence of a category, none of us would do well individually as distilleries. So what I really wanted to talk about was just what it takes to sell American Single Malt Whiskey to the world. It is absolutely hitting its stride as a category. It's the reason that we're sitting here doing this today. But also, it's relatively new to the world, it's relatively new to consumers, and you still see a lot of raised eyebrows when you say the words American Single Malt Whiskey. So just curious what your guys' experience is out in the world trying to talk about what this category is all about.
I can tell you, from my experience, I work at a distillery that like a lot of distilleries in the United States, we don't only make single malt, we make bourbon, we make rye, and single malt is really what we're pushing at this point in time. Bourbon obviously was very easy because it's been king in the United States for so long. To transition consumers, especially in our market, was very difficult to get them to drink Cedar Ridge bourbon, but also Cedar Ridge single malt. And one thing we did to kind of combat that is we literally changed the label and the packaging just of that one style of whiskey to something that would be more similar to a common style Scotch. And that, in our market at least, it really woke people up to what it was going to taste like. Someone could walk by that bottle and naturally assume what it was going to taste like and what it was going to represent. So that's one thing that we did on our end.
Presentation of it.
Just the presentation alone. And how we pour it, how we educate people on the product in general, obviously, but literally the appearance, the packaging, that was one thing that we did to kind of bridge that gap, because the popularity, trends in general have a tendency to start on the coast and work their way into the middle of our country. And that is where I'm located. And so this was especially difficult on our end. And so that's one thing that we did, is we just differentiate our packaging to at least start the process.
Yeah. It's another one of those areas where you're kind of dancing with innovating, but also providing some familiarity. Yeah. I don't think that's an interesting way to approach that.
But so tonight we're going to have what is the largest number of American single malt whiskey distillers in one room tasting to the public. So what is that interaction that you expect tonight from someone that just walks up to your table and says, tell me about what I'm drinking?
Some of our approach, we've talked about this a bunch and it's evolved, was trying to figure out kind of how to bridge the gap between what people expect and something that they're not familiar with. So our initial single malt that we did for years, it was the only one we had, was Scottish barley. Obviously, these are Forsyth stills, Forsyth mash tun. This, up to the time you've got your hearts cut, or your hearts collected, your new make, this couldn't be much more traditional. But then we were doing it in majority virgin oak.
In Texas.
So it was always really fun to watch. Someone comes by and they're like, I'm mostly a Scotch drinker. They think they're gonna like the single malt, and they're kind of not that pumped about it. And then the bourbon guys come by and it's in virgin oak, and they're like, oh, actually, surprisingly, I really like single malt. Like, yeah.
So you have to appeal to the Scotch drinker and the bourbon drinker, or at least speak to them in those terms.
It wasn't completely strategic. It was more so one of those question marks of like, what would this be like if we put virgin oak, but the substrate is not what we usually put in virgin oak. But that was it started conversations about both not only the distilling traditions, but even the maturation traditions of different whiskey regions that they are familiar with, and that this is combining those in a way you haven't had before. And at least it's the familiarity thing. Some of that was familiar, so then they could launch off of it. But I think as we all know, getting it in people to taste it probably makes the biggest difference of anything we could possibly do. Because usually they're surprised that they're like it, or they think they're going and they don't. There's a million ways that goes, but.
And people are often, skeptical of what they perceive as copycat products, right? And so, often someone immediately, they find out you make single malt and they're like, oh, I don't like Scotch, or I don't want a Scotch made in America.
I don't like smoky things.
Exactly. And so, I find it's best to approach them and figure out what they find compelling in whiskeys, and then try to bridge the gap between what I'm doing with what they like. And so if they're a bourbon drinker, right, the use of a new American oak that a lot of us distillers are using is a great way to say, hey, there's some of that caramel, vanilla that translates into the whiskey that you may be familiar with. Or if they love, sherried whiskeys, right? A lot of us are using interesting cask finishes that we can tie to. And I think the advantage of a Scotch whiskey drinker is they understand regionality more so than your bourbon or rye drinker does. And so then you can dive into some of the unique things that's going on in Texas or New Mexico or the Pacific Northwest as a way of saying, okay, you know about these concepts. Now let's explore how those concepts translate into a different place and a different product. And so it's really, you get people based off of what they find interesting rather than trying to sell them, this is not bourbon,
It's really nice. Early on, we had to have 2 or 3 different conversations were happening simultaneously. There's that one. What is American Single Malt? What the heck is this even? Texas whiskey doesn't exist. Young, like the age, it's like, well, this is less than 2 years old. Like you can't. It's nice being around for 15 years now that like I don't have to talk about Texas whiskey. Yeah. I don't have to educate on that anymore. We've been having the age conversation for a long time. And somewhere between 15 years ago, us selling stuff that's not even a year old, and people can buy 12 and 15 and 18 and 21-year-old bourbon, like no problem. That's gone away. Yeah. So those are younger, and all of our stuff's older, and that gap is almost gotten to 0 or pretty close, and it doesn't really seem that relevant anymore. So it's nice. Now this is like the only real thing that I have to spend much time thinking about how to try and like engage people on.
What's going to be really nice is in 20 years when distillers and salespeople and ambassadors are using American Single Malt as the reference. Well, if you like American Single Malt, let me tell you about this new thing that has just come along. So, but I think to get there, what's interesting and unique about American Single Malt right now is that everybody that I talk to and that's involved with the commission understands that in order for us to get to that point, we all have to kind of build the category at the same time as we build our own businesses and our own brands, which can sometimes feel odd and is sometimes difficult to explain to your CFO, right? Yeah. Why you're investing in something that has a sign that says American Single Malt on it and not a sign that says your brand on it. So, you guys all share this mentality. What convinced you to say, I'm on this boat?
I think there's just a giant opportunity here, and that's kind of what's getting everyone involved. But what I'm most excited about is the fact that we're not all bent out of shape about our personal market share in this category yet. Like you're kind of implying, eventually that will be the case. And things like bourbon, we're all very focused on what's my market share, what's your market share, what's their market share. In single malt, we're all very focused on growing the pie still. We want to make a bigger pie before we start fighting over market share. I think that's really exciting times. It's fun to be a part of. I know that if someone buys your product or someone buys Stranahan's or McCarthy's, there's a good chance they're eventually going to make their way to mine right now. And so rising tide raises all ships, and that's kind of the mentality of the association right now.
Yeah, it was really challenging, and 10 years ago, walking into a liquor store and knowing that they had your product, but not being able to find it because it might have been with the scotches or it might have been with the bourbon, and I knew if I couldn't find it, then our consumers weren't going to be able to find it, and if they did, they could be disappointed by where they found it, right? Yeah. Searching for our whiskey with all the bourbons, which are all priced at $34.99, and we had
at
a
least
different
10
price
years
point.
ago,
Yeah.
$28.99 10 years ago. Yeah. I was gonna say too. It's Texas whiskey was kind of the same. Like someday there's gonna be some battling over who gets to grab that consumer's attention, but we're so far from it. I'm glad that that's not really probably going to be a part of my interaction with this craft is figuring out how to steal Westland consumers and convert them.
I think that you can be competitive and still have a sense of camaraderie, and obviously that camaraderie exists today. I hope, like you said, Jared, when we're both in our rocking chairs on the porch, that that will still be the case, that the camaraderie still exists. And there's really no reason that it shouldn't. But yeah, I think it's just a part of being in a moment in time and the evolution of the category. Even Tyler, you said 10 years ago, you're referencing shelf, but I'm just remembering 10 years ago, the whiskey itself. And I would do a tasting and, there's some absolute stunning whiskeys in there. And then there were some that you're like, these guys are on their way, but they're not there yet. And I do whiskey tastings now where I have 10 single malt whiskeys from America on the table, and they're all excellent. So the level of quality is really, that's to me the starting point of the next chapter that's going to happen. And that's what it's going to make pitching American single malt a lot easier. Everybody's starting to get to know it. Everybody's like, what's this American single malt thing I keep hearing about, or I've had some.
Another
But
cultural
now-
phenomenon from the last 10, 15, 20 years is how style loyal people used to be.
Yeah.
Guys our age, 20 years ago, really common.
Yeah.
I'm a bourbon guy. I'm a Scotch guy. And now, even people our age have branched out, and everybody younger that's like gotten into whiskey since. I mean, it is absolutely normal for someone to have some Armagnac in there, some really cool rum. If they like brown spirits, it's probably mostly going to be brown.
Which you should.
But they're going to,
Yeah.
but they're going to have all kinds of stuff. They're going to have cool tequila experiments. They're going to just so that conversation of you walk up and someone's like, I don't do single malt. I don't do bourbon. Or I only do one of those. I don't feel like I have those conversations anymore. There's so much more, the connective tissue between pretty much any brown spirit. People see that, consumers understand that better. So that conversation is a lot easier. And then those transitions of how this might fit with something you already like, it's so much easier to make those connections.
Yeah,
than it
so
used to
are
be.
you guys noticing that the conversation is different than it was a few years ago, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I'm fortunately at the past few consumer-facing tastings I've done, I haven't had to explain what American single malt is, other than like twice, and usually it was like, okay, most of my time is being eaten up by explaining just the category that I exist in, let alone the liquid in the glass.
Consumers know a lot nerdier, more technical stuff than they did 10 years, 15 years ago.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, they don't know as much as they think they do sometimes. That's the annoying part. If they actually knew what they thought me too. If I
Well,
knew
that's
what
why everybody's taking this course. So,
Right.
right?
So we can clear them up with our version of the truth. There's a story I'll never forget. I was with one of our guys that does a lot of public-facing things. We were at a tasting, and it was mass. I mean, it was one of those, there's going to be thousands of people come by tonight. And I don't usually do stuff like that. And someone walked up and asked me, after sampling a few things with someone else, but then got to my end of the table, and wanted to know the difference between our pot still very funky, high ester, white rum. What's the difference between that and single malt? And I just froze.
Yeah.
I didn't even know how to begin to answer the question. And luckily, someone who does this all the time was very kind and like, okay, so rum is made. And then I started to answer it, and I was just like deer in the headlights. But now the question is like, is your wort clear or cloudy? Is it what's your cut points? What's your entry proof? It's crazy. And then
the
what
level
about
of
yeast
knowledge
strains?
is...
Once again, there's downsides to that as well.
Yeah.
But since those are the daily things that kind of occupy our thoughts as makers, that's a much more fun conversation to have, even if sometimes it gets off the rails a little bit. That's so much more engaging than literally explaining why rum and single malt are different.
Are you guys noticing that you have to... All right, there's an understanding broadly that Americans are making single malt, right? American single malt. Do you then have to say single malt from Iowa, and now there's questions about can single malt even be made in Iowa?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's confusing to people because it's just so outside of the box. I mean, in Iowa, we're in the middle of corn country. If anything makes sense at all, it's probably bourbon. And here we are producing single malt. But I think that's fun. I think it's an opportunity to educate people on the hows, the whats, and the whys. I mean, and kind of what our staple is within the category. Like I was saying earlier, I mean, it doesn't really make sense for us to hang our hat on locally grown barley or anything like that because we don't grow barley there. But what we do is we have a really extensive cask finishing program, and that's what our staple is. That's what our single malt's all about. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of transition the conversation over to that, what we are doing, why it matters, why it's different, and it really resonates with them.
Yeah, for Westland, we're very much a brand that's all about its sense of place. So I certainly do have to spend a lot of time describing that sense of place when I'm in New York or some other place that doesn't have a real strong tie to, the provenance that I'm speaking to. So yeah, but we did that to ourselves. It's not because the level of consumer doesn't understand.
But also there's some other cultural overlap with, I think, what's going on with consumer goods in general, food. I think you can try to have that communication centered around categories and styles and history and all that kind of stuff, or you can start talking about working on these heirloom varieties and technical things that people have a little bit of a tolerance. They don't want to hear on nothing but that. But it's similar to the place that you go in somewhere and they can tell you all our beef's from here. It's 28 miles that way. Yeah. You can stop there. They don't need to know the breed. Yeah. But just knowing that that level of intentionality went into what you do resonates. And so it can be we've been working with these farmers and trying to grow barley in the Panhandle for the last few years, and they're like, okay. And they're that's kind of it. They don't need to know much more than that. But then it kind of gets, in my experience, it kind of gets them out of thinking in these whiskey tradition and style parameters and categories, and then it starts getting them connected to where does my stuff come from, who makes it, what intentionality, all these other values they have. And the next thing you know, those considerations, they're not asking those old questions anymore.
Yeah, and that time is coming soon where we won't have to dwell so much on the category in establishing that baseline, and we can talk about the individual distillery, narratives or, the details of production and things that people do want to hear, but they only want to hear that if they have the context set for them of what they're hearing it for. And I think we're doing that, and I think we're well beyond the you just make Scotch. I think the Japanese did that for us. They proved that great single malt could be made outside of Scotland.
That's the thing I was going to say earlier is how much global single malt growth has absolutely changed things we used to have to talk about that now are way more familiar. Even hot climate. I've been on a few panels around global hot climate, India. Not even just whiskey, just spirits, hot climate spirits. And I'm on there with rum producers and India, Taiwan, even Australia, New Zealand. The fact that anybody even thought we should have a panel on spirits made in hot weather maturation climates was thank God. That's a thing finally. We're going to do that at a conference. Hell yeah, let's go. There's kind of there's some camaraderie there, I think, with even what's happening other places and people going, man, I had this Indian or Taiwanese whiskey. It actually reminded me of some of your single malt. I'm like, there's some reasons there. Yeah. It's probably 4 to 6 years old. It's really hot. Yeah.
I think we're definitely at that inflection point where the category is now established, right? And we can start to have those other conversations. And what's special to me is that American Single Malt and America has a voice in the global conversation that's happening. And I think that as it gets to pitching individual distilleries in the category at large, that's becoming easier and easier. And we've done ourselves a service in that we've brought something unique to the table or that's distinctly American that isn't just a copy of something else. And I think that that's really, again, the launching point for the next chapter, and which should be pretty exciting.
Yeah, we've talked about this many times before, but what a crazy deal to be a part of, establishing a new category of American whiskey.
Most people don't get this opportunity.
Very few people.
Once in a lifetime.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a pretty
exciting.
Combining that with how much regions, even 20 years ago, that states that didn't even have their own, or bioregions that didn't have their own, those two in combination to be a part of launching a state's traditions and also a category is I've kind of gotten to the point where wherever it goes, it's just it's been an honor
Still
anyway.
something you can be
it's
proud
just
of.
been killer, and what a gift, and who knew? Nobody planned on much of this happening this way. But
Wait, we didn't plan this?
at some point we started trying to be intentional with it. But by then it had already
Yeah.
started, the snowball was already rolling. But yeah, it feels like a pretty cool thing to get to try and spread the word about, because it's worth spreading the word about.
Absolutely.
You know?